Good morning, everybody. So thank you, first of all, thank you all for being here. We're really glad and excited, everyone who's attending in person, as well as those who are online. So my name is Daniel Jacobson Lopez. I'm an assistant professor at Boston University School of Social Work. Welcome and again, and thank you taking the time to join us this morning, both in person and of course those of you virtually on Zoom. I'd like to do a sound check for a Zoom audience. Please put into the Q&A if there are any issues with you hearing right now, and we'll be sure to check it. Ashley, are you able to confirm that everything looks good on the end for Zoom? Okay, thank you. I can talk. Okay. Okay. So hope people can hear me better now. Perfect. So before we begin with today's presentation, I'd like to say a few words. First of all, we would like to make a land acknowledgement. It's important to acknowledge that our school and Boston University at large are located in the ancestral lands of the Massachusetts people who have stewarded this land throughout generations prior to being occupied and taken by the arrival of England colonists and other Europeans. We recognize and respect the venturing relationship that exists between many indigenous people and their traditional homelands. And if you're virtual from somewhere else, please take time to look at what land is currently being occupied from indigenous folks as well. So each of our three presenters, scholars that we have, are going to speak from 20 to 30 minutes each. We will then have time for audience questions, both in person and on Zoom. For those on Zoom, please type your questions into the Q&A box, and we will take as much as time allows for. If you're a Massachusetts social worker attending this event for continuing education credits, you'll receive 2 CEUs. In-person attendees will be provided a QR code at the end of the event to complete a brief survey. Webinar attendees will be provided with the link at the end as well, and we will also email you a link at the end of the survey. Please know that photos will be taken throughout the event, as well as the event is being recorded both in person and online. If you're in person and do not wish to be photographed, we encourage you to sit towards the back of the room, please. People on Zoom can also choose to have their camera off. So now we're going to go get the program started. So I'd like to tell you a bit about the Emerging Scholars Program. Really excited to be here and talk to you all about the Emerging Scholars Program. Each year, academic departments at Boston University can apply through their school leadership and BUDNI to host an Emerging Scholars Program. And the goals of the Emerging Scholars Program are multifold. Are people still able to hear me? Okay. To strengthen our national and international networks, deepen our search pools, and positively impact our faculty search outcomes. Also to normalize the presence and inclusion from scholars from underrepresented communities and racial and ethnic groups in Boston University's academic departments. To enliven our curricula and intellectual and creative endeavors through consistent and substantive engagement with these emerging faculty. To prepare scholars from historically excluded groups and those who continue to be excluded within higher education for the academic job market, and encourage and excite emerging scholars for careers in academia. And of course, we need to know that scholars from underrepresented groups belong and are welcome within higher education. At the BU School of Social Work, this became an initiative of the Equity and Inclusion Committee that we have here. We invited 3 early scholars from underrepresented backgrounds in the academy to share their knowledge and expertise about climate and environmental justice with the entire Boston University community. Our program includes class visits with our Master of Social Work students, networking opportunities with scholars both in the School of Social Work and Public Health, as well as other academic departments, and this wonderful spring colloquium. Climate change is a defining crisis of our time. While social work scholars and practitioners have long committed to improving conditions for oppressed populations and communities most affected, there's a critical need for more research about the human dimension of climate crisis. In order to address the negative consequences of environmental injustice and ecocide, social work needs to develop effective policy, mitigation, and adaptation efforts through a multifaceted response based on interlocking principles of equity, sustainability, migration, resilience, and justice. We are delighted that one of the scholars speaking today, this just came through, so we're so excited to announce it right now. Darian Alexander Williams has accepted to join our Boston University School of Social Work faculty beginning in July 2023. So let's give an applause for Dar. Congratulations. So we're all just so excited to have you join, and welcome to BU School of Social Work and the BU community. So right now, I'm going to be happy to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Shanandora Billat. Dr. Billat, the United Homa Nation, is an assistant professor at Arizona State University with a research affiliation at the University of Houston. Her research uses mixed methods to explore indigenous-specific risks and protective factors to global environmental change exposure and pathways to health outcomes with indigenous populations with the goal to co-develop adaptation activities. Dr. Billat is currently a co-PI, principal investigator, on an interdisciplinary team exploring resilience, culture, climate, and movement among the indigenous community on the Gulf course, which is funded by the Gulf Research Program Thriving Communities Grant. She serves as a technical advisory member of the Climate Change Task Force for the National Congress of American Indians, as well as an advisory board member for the Social Responses to a Changing Environment Grand Challenge, led by the Academy of Social Workers. In addition, she is also a liaison member of the Community Board for Engagement and Evaluation of the Gulf Research Program within the National Academies of Sciences, Medicine, and Engineering. So let's please all give an applause and a warm welcome to Dr. Billat.
Thank you, Danny. I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me because I tend to speak softly. Online, we're good? Great. Thank you, BU, the School of Social Work, the Planning Committee, and especially Greer Hamilton for pulling this all together. I hope to be a very good planner like her when I grow up. So I just want to make sure I have this correct. All right. Aluto Seu Acha Santabeyo Uma Seya Dulak Amatehela. Again, my name is Shanandora Billat. I am Homa. I come from the town of Dulac in southern Louisiana. Our first instructions come from our family. For me, it came from my grandparents there. Their knowledge comes from their ancestors, whose knowledge comes from the land. So I greatly appreciate you all doing a land acknowledgement. Wherever you are in the world of Zoom, you are on ancestral lands of an indigenous community. These lands carry memory through their stories of the struggle and survival and identity in the face of overwhelming colonizing power. When we become aware of the pedagogy of our land, we begin to watch and listen to the stories of that land, and we can then begin to heal the ruptures of the past. You can learn more about how to find the indigenous communities of where you are by going to native/land.ca. I also have to acknowledge that the research reported in this presentation is funded by the Early Career Fellowship of the Gulf Research Program, housed at the National Academies of Sciences, Medicine, and Engineering. So I'm going to give a quick overview of my theoretical framework. I'm going to discuss previous research, some current research, and then where I think that the field should be going in terms of, the field of social work should be going in terms of environmental justice. Globally, about 22% of our land surface is managed, used, or owned by approximately 370 million indigenous peoples who live in approximately 70 countries and constitute about 5,000 separate groupings. This means that only 6% of the world's population maintains over 80% of our world's biodiversity. And so when we think about indigenous peoples around the world, typically indigenous peoples contribute the least to changes in their environment, but are most disproportionately affected by the changes due to reasons of living in close proximity to vulnerable ecosystems, the social, spiritual, cultural, and traditional lifestyles that are deeply reliant on the natural resources for subsistence and cultural practices. Also, the fact that many indigenous people's creation stories are rooted in our physical environment. Due to historical events, indigenous peoples as a group are disproportionately among the poorest of their societies and have the greatest health disparities. While these changes are felt differently around the globe, it is consistent. Whenever I conduct my research, I do the best that I can to honor indigenous perspectives. And so I see research as a ceremonial process that tries to continue to build and maintain our relationships, respect the knowledges that are shared with me, taking that responsibility to gain the knowledge that in privacy that is given in privacy and hold it in confidence. And I try to be available to the communities that I work with for consultation for various reasons. Taking these steps to allow the community to define the problem benefits not only the community, but ultimately the data that we receive, that we analyze. My work is situated, that I'm discussing here, is situated in southern Louisiana. So coastal Louisiana has lost an average of 34 square miles of land per year for the last 50 years, last 70 years really. This is approximately 1,900 square miles, and it is greater than the size of the state of Delaware. Back in 2000, when this research first started being demonstrated, it was predicted that if nothing is done by 2050, an additional amount about the size of the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. area will have been lost. 60% of that land is lost in the parish or county called Terrebonne Parish, and that is where the majority of United Homa Nation tribal citizens live. And it is also considered one of the most vulnerable counties in the United States. These coastal communities are, as a whole, are exposed to environmental risk, which impact mental health, food security, water supply, and physical infrastructure. And you can see the outline of the 5 parish areas that are in our service area. This is a greater picture of it. So you can see that the majority, or that the land that's lost is where our tribal citizens are. Upon entering my PhD program, I wanted to gain knowledge about the extent of coastal erosion. And so I did some focus groups, and these were the themes that led me to on the path to where I am now. So essentially, participants talked about how the water eats the land, how the land has been taken, how citizens are denied access to not only land but to to socio-cultural aspects like education, grocery stores, and also that the land itself is generous. So I developed this, my initial research with my community advisory council that consisted of elders along the bayous. Another aspect of research that is broader than just coastal erosion is the overall aspect of global environmental changes. And so that we're on the same page, I like to define it for you so that way you know that when I say global environmental changes, I mean changes in the physical and geochemical environment, either caused naturally or influenced by human activities, such as deforestation, fossil fuel consumption, urbanization, overexploitation, and waste production. Global environmental changes includes disasters, as well as changes to our long-term climatic cycles, like climate change, that are driven by human activities, causing disturbances of our ecosystem. I will be talking about community-based adaptation research, but so you know that there are 4 types of adaptation research. The top 3 are mostly built around policies at the nation-state level, the state level, or regional level, whereas community-based adaptation activities are developed and implemented at the community level. For the development of the adaptation that I'm going to talk about was done in several phases. The first phase was a baseline phase where we interviewed 150 citizens that were over 30 to compare differences in subsistence activities and their exposure to environmental changes. Phase 2 was the development of the intervention that I would talk about, returning to our roots, and then my current study with climate, culture, and movement that was introduced in the introduction. So the first study of 150 participants, the average age was 55. 43% were female, 82% were in a serious relationship, not necessarily in a formal legal marriage, because most people that were in this study didn't have necessarily a birth certificate or the ability to have a legal marriage. 24% had a high school degree or above. 61% spoke Homa French as their first language. 39% attended Indian school. And while the mean for income was around 30,000, the range was so large that typically they made it between 12 and 15,000. I used the CDC health-related quality of life for this study, and so when asked, in the last 30 days, how many days have you felt healthy and full of energy? Just over 1 day was the average. How many days in the last 30 days have you felt emotionally or mentally ill? 6.5 days was the average. And then how many days in the last 30 days have you felt physically ill? And just over 6 days was the average. And so for context, in case you're not familiar with this particular measure, a pre-COVID study in New York City of around 2,300 survey participants found the average days of being physically, mentally, or emotionally ill was about 4 days in the last 30 days. Sorry, I meant to talk about the mini screening. The mini international neurological psychiatric interview screening and diagnosis tool I used for PTSD, depression, and anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, mainly because that's the three mental health outcomes that are reported in disaster literature. And so the red shows that 4% met diagnosis for PTSD, 15% met diagnosis for depression, and then 17% met diagnosis for generalized anxiety disorder, where you can see that there is a greater screening for both PTSD and generalized anxiety disorder. In looking at the sociocultural risk and protective factors of age, gender, discrimination, ethnic identity, historical loss, and social support, as well as exposure to environmental changes on mental health, which would be if they met criteria for one of those diagnoses, then you can see that age, gender, discrimination, ethnic identity, which I'll talk about in a second, and social support and exposure to environmental changes were significantly, all had significant findings to meeting criteria for a mental health diagnosis. When I tried to look at it as a mediating effect between exposure to environmental changes and ethnic identity. You can see that it technically met criteria for, or it technically was significant, but however, so little, it really didn't have much meaningful significance. I'm going through these very fast, so we'll have time for questions. So in the qualitative portion of this study, key findings showed the cyclical nature between sociocultural events, physical environmental changes, and impacts. Anthropogenic activities causes changes in the environment. People talked about the water's changed, the coast has changed. These changes led to a loss of medicines and harvest. Participants said, we didn't go to the doctor or anything like that, but I believe those days are gone. Another participant discussed the harvest changes in terms of volume and size. In one participant's discussion, he talked about the lack of brown shrimp. He says they don't get big because of the water. I don't know if it's the water that's changing, but there's not as much brown shrimp as we used to have. So not only has the shrimp gotten smaller in size, but harvesters are catching less in volume now than in the past, which has led to impacts on health and livelihood. Participants believe their health is impacted by changes in the environment. Participants also receive less revenue today than in past generations that for their harvest yield. Same participant talked about the pricing. The shrimp used to be like $8 or $7 a pound, and now you're lucky to get $2 a pound. This was in 2016, and the price has actually gone down from that. I think it was over this past shrimping season, which is the August season, which was about $1.50. So that's led to a loss of cultural knowledge that's being passed and reiterated among generations, like treaters, or having the ability to pass on sustainable harvesting practices. One participant talked about, my mom used to be a treater. She treat people from all different places. She wanted to train my sisters, but they didn't take to it like she knew it. They remember some of the things, but they can't do that kind of practice anymore. I don't have any sisters living now. So this has also led to a loss of knowledge and protecting the land, and changes to harvesting or trapping methods. Every year, they would burn the marsh when the trapping season closed. It would keep the marsh hard. We can't do that. Can't do that anymore. Indigenous practices, including things like burning the marsh annually, has led to United Homa Nation practices being outlawed, like trapping. And finally, these changes, these anthropogenic activities have led to further changes, damages in the environment. In this mixed method study, I found that for the majority of the outcomes, the qualitative themes converged, with the exception of things that I didn't know to ask, like limited protection of land and cultural knowledge, which I didn't have quantitative data to assess if there was a convergence or not. This led to the development of the behavioral health intervention as a community-based adaptation called Returning to Our Roots, which was a HOMA-centered, age-relevant 12-week behavioral health intervention that targets behavior change related to the health and environment. It's a land-based healing intervention that is implemented in 3 phases, intended to expand from the individual to the community with a theory of behavioral change that goes from environmental awareness to leadership to community influence. So this intervention was as I said, 12-week intervention that culminated in a return or a walking tracing of our route from where we were at contact with the French to where they are now, which covers 126 miles over 7 days. In the pilot, we did an average of 4 days per mile, 4 miles per day, and paddled canoes an average of 3 miles on 3 of those days. In our pilot, we had participants that were from 21 to 95 years old, and every single person did that walk and canoe. We conducted pre and post interviews as well as 2 focus groups with the overall goal of identifying cultural health beliefs through the MI curriculum in order to inform a culturally relevant and sustainable health promotion intervention model. Along the way, we asked, what kind of ancestor do you want to be? And these are quite long quotes. I apologize for that because we only have 30 minutes. The gist of it is that that the participants talked about, one participant talked about the fact that she doesn't think about being an ancestor all the time, but that doing this intervention reminded her to be more cognizant of it, and she actually was able to learn history and practices along the way. This is us learning how to make traditional baskets from palmetto leaves. They also talked about responsibility for future generations. I just think it's part of hitting that piece of home of that we have a responsibility. Maybe it is that little seed planted about that I have a responsibility as an ancestor to further something along for someone, because I think I definitely walked away with feeling a lot stronger, and I wish we would have more money to be able to continue doing this. This led to the development of a HOMA health model that incorporates our ancestral knowledge, narratives, spirituality as part of ceremony with the land and water and place. So our current research, I'm looking for the person who's supposed to tell me 5 minutes. Thank you. My current research is funded, as mentioned, by the National Academies, and we started with the research question: how can United Homa Nations sustainably adapt to acute and long-term stressors while maintaining the integrity of its community and culture? And so we started developing this in 2018, And we came together, it's 5 universities, we came together at the request of the United Home Nation. And so these are these were our goals at the time to characterize the role of movement, look for what are the implications for resilience at the community, household, and individual level, to examine community perspectives on movement. What are the factors that influence their decision-making process to move, and what are the short and long-term implications of movement? We got our funding in late 2019. We started in January 2020, and our entire project has changed. And right now, we're really just looking at the first part. What is the role of movement? And we developed a household level measure for community resilience. And so I don't really have any data still to talk about that, but this is where we are with this project. So forward looking, we hope to understand the extent to which exposure impacts migration, not only so this is the project's study, forward looking, but then also me personally, I hope to be able to expand that outside of United Homo Nation. How does changes in our environment, how does climate change impact our migration? What motivates individuals to take climate action, to work on adaptation activities? And I hope that that we can measure movement. It is proving incredibly difficult in this study. Not only do we have COVID, but we also had Hurricane Ida. The survey portion is the part that I'm over. We had a randomized sample of, we hope to get 250 participants. We sampled 990 citizens, and we had our research assistants call and mail. We did 3 mailings. Our initial attempt only got in touch with 40 people, because so many people have moved since Hurricane Ida. And then, of course, we want to understand how to implement and utilize land-based healing interventions, not only for Indigenous peoples, but for all peoples as behavioral health. So I believe that that research in social work or social sciences is needed to understand the extent to which exposure impacts health and health disparities, exposure to environmental changes, and what motivates individuals, as I mentioned, to take climate action and adaptation action, and how can we move away from individualist to collective action. Each community is unique, and so sorry, my mom's calling and I'm caring for her, so I'm like, I'm sorry, I have to tell you no. Oh, life. So cultural competency is a lifelong journey, not a destination. It's our job as researchers to understand the ceremonial process of research among Indigenous peoples. I hope that we can advocate for different application of process for community-involved research that allows flexibility with community projects. Environmental changes, acute and chronic, are occurring and will continue to occur in our lifetime. How we prepare for, respond to, and adapt to these changes will define not only us in our time, but will continue to impact our 7 generations to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Billat, for all the research you do and the work you're doing that is much needed. So let's do one more round of applause. So our next speaker is Dr. Aurelua Badaki. Dr. Badaki is a postdoctoral fellow at Teachers College at Columbia University. Her research and writing focuses on the pedagogical and methodological possibilities of creative, critical, and collaborative literacy practice within environmental justice education. Dr. Badaki earned her PhD from the Literacy, Culture, and International Education Division at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education. Shout out to GSE. Her dissertation work, which focused on the literacy practices of youth of color working in urban agriculture, received the Ralph C. Preston Award for Scholarship and Teaching Contribution to Social Justice. So now let's please give a warm welcome to Dr. Badaki.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to also jump on the checking in. How are we doing? We can hear me. I would ask the folks online to put their thumbs up, but I won't be able to see it. So can someone let me know if they can hear me okay? Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So gratitude to you all for being here. I'm all about bandwagons today. I'm also going to shout out Greer. She is unlike any other. We've talked, some of the emerging scholars and I have just talked about how taken care of we felt, and having this be a conversation about the cross-pollination in our work, but also kind of the seeds that we're planting here, and just to have someone who's so caring to facilitate that is wonderful. So I'm also going to give gratitude to my family, both chosen and given, as well as the non-human entities that sustain us and help us, including land. And I'm going to build on a lot of what Dr. Villa was talking about, so I'm grateful that you went before me. My friend Nathan, or Nate, which do you prefer? Nate? Okay, you're going to help me out with this because I cannot do technology. This way? This way. Excellent. Okay. So before we get started, I'm going to ask to ground us first in an invitation to center three things: our breath, our attention, and our connection. So I'm going to ask you just to indulge me. Let's go with it. We're going to take some collective breaths together, and before that, I'm going to ask you to put your hands together in prayer position and just create some friction. Create some warmth and some friction. You can close your eyes. This is kind of an activity for you, so you don't need to kind of know what's going on elsewhere. In a second, I'm going to ask you to release and place your hands on a part of your body that you feel like could use some extra love. Maybe it's aching, maybe it's felt a little off recently. Just add some energy to a place in your body that you feel like could use some love. And folks online, if you've got family and friends next to you, please feel free to invite them as well. We're going to release and take 2 deep breaths and release. Exhale. Inhale. Exhale. Okay. Go with it. Again, just got some percussionists in here. I see. Excellent. So the first half of that, the second half I made a little easier. So sorry, the first group, but you did a fantastic job. So the first half of that was a basic rhythm called lamban. It's the kind of architecture, the beginnings to seeds of a rhythm called lamban, which is the backbone for a dance and drumming system that dates back to the 12th and 13th century of the Malian Empire. Lamban means, by many accounts, to make more grace. It is a both celebratory and healing dance. It is sometimes also called jelidon or jelifoli, which means jelly's dance or jelly's rhythm, because it belongs to the jelly people, who are the griots, the historians, and the keepers of oral tradition. We just played a very basic, the first half was a very basic version of an accompaniment that's usually sometimes played by the djembe, which is not always traditionally within lamban movement. And we might come back to this at the end, so hold on to that. Before I move on, I know my dance instructor is gonna be really angry at me if I don't say that there are lots of variations to this beat. So everybody does it differently. I'm not a drummer, I'm a dancer, and that's the beat that I hear. So if he's like in a corner somewhere, you know, about to jump out and say I did it wrong, I'm saying it now, right? That was the architecture, the first steps. So if this was a seminar or a class or a movement workshop that I teach, I'd pause here to hear your reflections about what you noticed about the rhythmic patterns of your breathing during the activation, about how your attention traveled in the space in the absence of spoken words, or about what or when or how you felt most drawn to as the percussive echoes filled the room. In the interest of time, I won't do that now, but hopefully at the end, maybe you can give me some reflections. And I would ask these questions because they are essential for understanding the engine of much of my work as a researcher, writer, educator, and movement practitioner. And this work is anchored in this question. Nope. Yes. Oh, so close. Yes. Let's see. I knew this was going to happen. Yes, okay. So my question is, what stories can our bodies remember and reimagine about our relationship to land? I'm interested in how power moves through bodies and spaces within food and land systems. And here I want to highlight two terms within this question. I try to be intentional about each word and revisit this question. But right now I'm thinking about the word remember. Remember comes from the Latin word rememoria, which means to call back to mind. But if we split the word up, we also see member, which in modern English means a part of a whole. So I see this as a call to understand how our bodies not only help us recall our history, but also help us engage more consciously with the sociological networks we are part of. I include the term reimagine along with remember to point to the future. The interplay between the past, the present, and future is beautifully anchored with the Akan term sankofa, which means to go back and get it, and a reminder that we must look back in order to move forward. The late Mamadi Keita, one of the foremost djembe drummer masters in the world, sometimes called his improvisations future traditional rhythms, pointing to the fact that just like he was also drawing on the traditional rhythms of the past, future generations would draw on his rhythms. I have also highlighted the term land here. I do so to foreground the fact that an embodied analysis of place or space in the US, whether part of environmental or ecological or climate justice, needs to understand that it is taking place on violently stolen land. Settler colonialism was predicated on at least two barbaric thefts, that of indigenous land and that of African bodies. And as we meet here today on the lands of the Wampanoag and Massachusetts people, I hope we consider how our own people came to interact with this land, whether by choice, by force, or whether we have always and will always be here. I think about how our bodies can learn to remember and reimagine these stories in ways that move towards healing, repair, and justice. So next I think about this term diaspora. A key aspect of understanding the stories of forced removal and migration is understanding the concept of diaspora. My work is rooted with the stories of the African diaspora, and I draw from C.C. Jaji's conceptualization of diaspora as echolocation, the acoustic process by which emitted sound reflects back information about one's surroundings and one's bearings. This is a powerful and dynamic practice used by people who are visually impaired as well as by animals like dolphins and bats, and in Jaji's study of the pioneering music and art forms that arose from the African diaspora, she highlights the expansive and connective potentialities of an embodied and material echolocation. She quotes, or I quote her, "It is the material sound itself, whether in the striking of the drum and other percussion or in the stinging articulation of whip hide against hot skin that renders present the spirits of human beings and gods. Symbols and metaphors were not only human bodies, but also nature's objects. Boulders, lightning, pools, and flowers are all open to the mysterious and enlivening beat of a divine rhythm." So coming back to our breath, to our attention, and to our connections, within a collective embodied percussive exercise, Jaji shows how echolocation can help us become more attuned to the ways we engage with our surroundings. This is at the crux of my work on embodied storytelling, or creative storytelling that understands the body as a meaningful text for information and communication within environmental justice. So why embodied storytelling? My wider dissertation work was a 3-year critical ethnography on the creative and critical literacy practices of youth of color working in urban agriculture. I worked within a larger USDA study on the role of community food initiatives on community health, as well as the Philadelphia Urban Agricultural Development Plan. And I'm happy to talk more about those wider projects after the presentation, but today I want to focus on the stories of some of the young people I've been working with over the past couple of years. Yes. So I met Shauna early on in my fieldwork. She would eventually become known among the young people in my study for her smart and funny, respectfully timed outbursts. But in this early interview, she expressed a deep fear that she was harboring. She says, "It's a lot of bad things like messing up the world, like global warming. I was having thoughts that the world is going to end and all that stuff. So then I was like, what can I do?" The question Shauna poses about what she can do to address global warming is a question that many young people are asking. They are facing an uncertain future that is projected to bring about severe health, education, and environmental challenges. Youth civic engagement is a key propellant of environmental and climate justice movements, yet there is an emergence and rise of terms like climate anxiety and solastalgia being associated with young people. Studies have found higher levels of pessimism and lower levels of hope found among groups of older adolescents, and simply learning more cognitively about climate change does not necessarily result in action. In some cases, more knowledge can even lead to greater fear and hopelessness. Creating opportunities for creative and speculative, imaginative storytelling about climate change that connects young people to the embodied ways humans have always navigated their environments can prove useful for improving young people's sense of self-efficacy and turning theory into embodied action. So this is an op-ed I wrote a couple years ago, and it's based off of a story that Shauna, who I just quoted, wrote not too long after the interview that quote came from. It was part of an activity that youth interns were doing to better understand the way power and narrative works within the food system. And understanding the story of seeds, and not just the productive capacity of seeds, was a theme that came up over and over again in my interviews. And Shauna had written a story about seeds in hair. This was a story that many of the young people found particularly captivating, and it sort of focused on this idea of our West African ancestors braiding seeds into the hair of their descendants before they crossed the transatlantic. Some of which, a lot of this research stems from Judith Carney's critical geography around the role enslaved African women played in bringing over and cultivating rice in the Carolinas. But the literal nature of the story is contested, at least by food historian Michael Twitty, who during an interview exclaims, "If I hear that line one more time, I'ma scream." He argues that the feasibility of this sort of transfer, for various reasons, such as the fact that many Africans had their heads shaved on the slave ships, is unlikely. However, what many agree on is that this is a powerful metaphor for the advanced agricultural knowledge, technology, and skills enslaved Africans brought with them. Twitty argues that we kept this knowledge in our heads and that seeds in the hair is a metaphor for that. I was particularly interested in Shauna's story, as well as the stories of other youth interns, because they spoke to the knowledge our bodies hold, how that knowledge echoes back to our ancestry, and what that can tell us about where we are and where we're going. Also, given the politics of African hair, which many of the young people I work with were also dealing with, there were many points of critical inquiry to unpack. So with that, we embarked on a reimagination of Shauna's story. And my last year of fieldwork was a participatory inquiry group where we started a creative writing initiative to bring these stories to life. And we embarked on a collaborative Afrofuturist screenplay, some of which you will hear today. Okay, I'm gonna need more help, Nate. So I wanna play Troy. And so let's see if it,
never understood why people just had such an appreciation for certain
Ada is
things.
part of a group of orphans sent to become food cultivators on a new planet. Along the journey, she finds that she can time travel in her dreams, that her destiny is tied to the powerful okra seed. With the help of her friends, Ada has to unlock the mystery of her past in order to reveal a hidden conspiracy that threatens all of their futures. This is her story.
Dun, dun, dun. So hopefully, sorry? Oh yeah, the front, actually the top would be good, thank you.
Never understood why people just had such an appreciation for certain things. Like, I watch food shows and stuff, but it always seemed like trivial in a way. Like, food is just food, it tastes good, whatever. Right. But you never really think about who made it taste that way, or where did it come from, or why did this happen? Like, what is the story behind it?
Thank you. So here we see this emphasis on story in both Vi's reflection, right? She doesn't ask the information, the statistics behind it. She asks, what's the story behind food? And the story that these young people have come up with, you see elements of justice, you see elements of hegemony, you see elements of big corporation in the food system, right? They're grappling with these issues that they're dealing with, that they're learning about in their internships at the farm, in this narrative storytelling. And so in the previous slide, the top had said good science fiction requires good science. The building Ada's worlds, therefore, was not just about creating new realities so that we could absolve ourselves of the mistakes we've made in this one, nor was it about ignoring the science and the truth of the world we live in. In order to write creatively about food cultivation, climate change, land theft, and cultural erasure, we needed to understand how they operated in the world we lived in. Imagining a better future, therefore, requires keen and purposeful observation of the present. It requires science. Writing the story of Ada required an integration of the sciences and the creative arts, and this is the sort of interdisciplinary creative climate communication education scholars like Doyle argue can help them build a sense of responsibility that promotes thoughtful and responsive action. And then just on a side note, Dorothy Frontberry, who is a writer and producer, a TV writer and producer, kind of flips this notion of science fiction on its head. And she's famous for saying, if climate isn't in your story, then it's most definitely science fiction because you are ignoring a critical aspect of our reality. So there's different ways to kind of approach this. So here, another kind of theme that emerged from our work together was this idea of real-world food systems understandings through this imaginative story making and world building. We're going to hear, hopefully these are right, and I don't think it matters the order, so let's see what happens. These are all pseudonyms, by the way, just to protect the identity of the young people I worked with.
Like, my story, if I told it more and I got more attention on the issue, more funding to these social programs, more students would be able to be on the farm and get funded. And I just feel like this immense responsibility to do my part.
And before I go on, I'm just going to note the the similarities between one of the quotes that you had shared, Dr. Billard, about responsibility, about funding. So Nira at that point had just been given a letter that was basically telling her that the funding stream that she had used to work at the farm was dwindling. So this was hot, kind of off the press and in her mind. But at the same time, she's not just worried about herself, right? She's like, I want more people here, and if I can't even be here, what are the chances for others? And next we'll hear from Sam.
Well, one of my favorite is like when Miss she talks about like how like we brought certain things from Africa over here, like how we didn't let like as we were being brought here, we didn't just leave behind our past. We also brought like different types of food, farming techniques and stuff like that with us, and we didn't let it die down. And to this day, like on the farm, we continue to use it.
So I wanted to use more of Sam's quote, but I didn't want to use too much of the time. Before this, he had just talked about how going to the farm was one of the places. He's also a producer, and he writes rap music. So he talks about having to clear his head, and being physically in the land was one way he was able to do that, and feel kind of like a less linear temporality between his existence and the existence of his ancestors. And so we come back to this notion of echolocation, of kind of putting forth out energy to kind of figure out our bearings, and then using that to move forward. The story of Ada is not yet complete. It is very hard to write with a lot of high schoolers. They got a lot of stuff going on. But part of why we wanted to do this collaboratively is because we wanted to show, to kind of deconstruct the notion of kind of the lone genius writer who's in their like cabin in the woods, being brilliant. But at the same time, even if you are alone, you have these voices, you have these experiences with folks that are bringing sort of new ideas for you. And collaborative writing is kind of an oxymoron in some ways, because everything we write is a integration of lots of voices. But having to do that physically, especially writing for performance, which I'll talk about a little later, was something that the youth in this writing group were definitely challenged by, but were up for the challenge. And that, I will say, that had to do a lot with the fact that we had all worked for 3 years together, up until that point. So a lot of the groundwork had been, and you're always continuing coming back to building relationships, but there was a rapport that was built up. So the writing group allowed opportunities for youth writers to unpack the questions and challenges of their lived realities as they imagine new realities and universes and futures for the characters in their story. Opening up a space to collectively critique unjust structures and imagine systems that are responsive to the needs of the communities they serve is an important step towards bringing those stories to life in our real shared realities. And the last theme, which I just kind of hinted at, is storytelling with embodiment and performance in mind. So this is not a story that's meant to be read. And as a literacy researcher, I do kind of understand the multimodality of the written word in and of itself. But there is something that happens when what you're writing is actually going to inform how people move through space, the actors, and how people see the world, the audience. And so that was kind of a central aspect. You'll see these are some of the character sketches that young people were doing, youth writers were doing as we went along. So the first one is a first iteration of what Ada would look like. And this is, she's on the bottom. The first scene is her mom braiding her hair, braiding something into her hair, as this notion of braiding scenes into hair was kind of like the crux. And then this was maybe 5 or 6 months later, another youth writer took this kind of sketch and then did a kind of more elaborate. And these are all characters based off of who their friends, their family, and so they're bringing themselves into this space. So through their story, though their story takes place in the future and involves time travel, youth writers at Quest, which is the pseudonym for this farm, sought to root their main character, Ada, in their contemporary understandings of the histories, the language, the hairstyles, and the seeds of Ada and their culture. Augusto Boal argues that theater was originally free people singing in the open air, before ruling classes took possession of the theater and built their dividing walls. They separated spectators from actors and isolated the idea of protagonists as someone that could only exist on stage and not someone from the masses. A theater or poetics of the oppressed, Boal argues, goes beyond the catharsis centered in Aristotelian orientations in theater, or an awakening of critical consciousness centered in Brechtian notions, and instead invites the spectator themselves to assume the protogenic role. The spectator changes the dynamic, the dramatic action, and tries out solutions, and discusses plans for change. In short, they train themselves for real action. By using the story of Ada to challenge and talk back to some of the oppressive structures they and their communities have been subjected to, youth writers at Quest were able to assume the protogenic role and to take on a more agentive role in the narratives of their lives. So with that, I'm going to ask us to come back to our breath, to our attention, and to our connection, and call us back to the narrative of our own lives. And I think here it's important to note that centering the body is not always liberatory or healing. I think some of the research that you showed us shows that some of us feel very trapped in our bodies or trapped because of our bodies. And so being mindful of what that means in these spaces is imperative. During scene devising exercises or improvisations, during the writing group, there were uncomfortable exchanges had, and we had to work through those together. And there's also the politics, the complicated politics surrounding land work and Black people. Many of the young people in the group were part of families that deliberately moved north during the Great Migration so their children's bodies would not have to be subjected to land work. And the fact that they were now working on a farm was not always kind of met with open arms, right? So there are complexities and there are tensions, but the point of centering is to kind of face them in ways that feel productive and humanizing. And I do have one last invitation for movement. How much time do I have? 5? Ooh, good job, all right, okay. I still have some time. I am going to play the lamban rhythm one more time, okay? And hopefully you can hear some of, at least the first part of that rhythm. I'm gonna do some, sorry? Was it? Oh, I think I missed something. Okay. I'm going to do some lamban movement. So lamban is a healing dance. That's the point. It's a dance there's different variations of it. There's kind of celebratory, wedding, and one of the purposes of it is to cleanse the space, right? And there has probably, I don't know very much about the place and space here, but there's probably been a lot of violence just like in any major city. La Paperson has a famous quote where he says, behind every great city is a great crime. And that is consistent, and especially in the US. So I'm going to do some lamban movements. You can either do the variations we did earlier. You can just clap along if you would like to come join me. Please feel free. You can take a nap. I don't know. Whatever feels healing for you. And we'll just close out with that. Thank you. You are so on top of it, Nick. So I'll show you the variation that I was going to do with the claps, and then we'll go from there. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Dr. Radaki. So let's give another round of applause to Dr. Radaki. Thank you so much for all the work you're doing, improving communities, and also for getting us moving today and really centering with ourselves. So thank you. So next, I'd like to introduce Darian Alexander William. Darian, not only being the newest member of BUSSW, he's also a PhD candidate at Urban Studies and Planning at MIT's School of Architecture and Planning, where he focuses on Black and Muslim urban planning history, disaster recovery, and community organizing. His dissertation project examines methods of counter-institution building developed by Black Muslims grappling with segregation and land clearance as they shaped neighborhoods across the 20th century, with particular attention given to Roxbury, Massachusetts. By drawing on diverse sources, such as archival documents, organization financial records, the Black press, interview data, and present-day fieldwork, his project maps the claims that are made by Black religious and nationalist groups who challenge common assumptions about citizenship, identity, and planning power. So let's please welcome Darian Alexander Williams.
Thank you. Y'all are tough acts to follow, honestly. Like, I feel, but I feel really grateful to be in this space with y'all, and to, I know in my bio we heard a little bit about Black Muslim urban planning history. I'm not going to be talking about that today, but we can talk about it some other time because I will be around. But I'm really grateful that we can sit together and maybe talk about the intersection of climate or climate change specifically, carceral infrastructure, and specifically a growing movement of regional, really locally rooted abolitionist organizing at this intersection. And then I have had the privilege of sharing a little bit of some of this work with y'all in the past, but we're going to veer in a slightly different direction, and I'm going to ask you to be an accomplice of mine, so hopefully a few of you feel enabled to do so. So my name is Darian Alexander Williams, he, him pronouns. I'm from Jacksonville, Florida, which is on Mikoski and Timucua land. As mentioned earlier, I do a lot of work around development, community organizing, history, EJ, specifically disaster recovery and climate change adaptation. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how alternative institutions are built. So not just what scholars critique about institutions that we deal with every day, but how do other people model their critiques by doing something else and getting a group together to try out new things, and what can be learned from this. So I want to share a bit about what brings me into this line of work, maybe share a little bit about abolitionist hurricane organizing. I want to make the case for some work that probably should be done in New England, that we're getting started, done in the New England area, and learning from some case examples, like some of our comrades in Texas. And then I invite you to at least check things out and see where, you know, you can plug in your efforts if you would like. And I like to begin with this photo, which is taken in a residential neighborhood in Florida following a hurricane, my home state. And if you are Floridian or from another state that grapples with hurricane recovery on a pretty regular basis, then this might be pretty familiar to you. So after a storm blows through an area, there might be, you know, fallen trees, debris, houses in disrepair, and it's pretty common to drive around and see signage like this that reads "State Prisoners Working," where incarcerated people are grappling with a variety of very complicated tasks associated with debris clearance, making sure roads are safe, dealing with working under a guard or a corrections officer, and dealing with rather hazardous working conditions. And it's pretty common in Florida emergency management community of practice to draw on this form of labor after a storm comes through the region, but it is pretty uncommon for these people, the incarcerated people in the state prison system, to be mentioned in emergency management plans, to be included in community engagement processes, thinking about hazard mitigation. And they're essentially invisibilized in many different planning documents, despite the physical facilities being surrounded by communities of unincarcerated people. And so a lot of my work in this realm is with groups of people that are kind of critical of both ends of this, critical of both how these people in these facilities are invisibilized, and then very critical of how they are suddenly hyper-visible as a source of labor to the surrounding community when they need some form of disaster recovery. And so that brings me into abolitionist hurricane organizing, which honestly a friend brought me into this world. Beginning to ask a question around how do such organizers make interventions at this intersection of prisons and climate change specifically. And of course, this work is legal in much of the United States because of the 13th Amendment almost abolishing slavery, except as punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. Many state constitutions are starting to outlaw this, but it's still legal at the federal level. And first, I want to start with my collaborators, largely from the Texas Prisons Community Advocates, TPCA, which was started by families concerned about the lack of air conditioning in prison facilities across the state of Texas. They've since expanded to a variety of conditions on the inside. And sometimes they work alongside or they're in the same space as the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons, which is explicitly an abolitionist organization. We'll get into what that's looked like for them. That rallies support for incarcerated people in the wake of environmental hazards and following disaster events. They do everything from raising money to buy people supplies on the inside, to pressuring public officials to evacuate, to agitating in the streets, and also sort of building circles to imagine a world without incarceration. I admire both of these organizations because I think they do both of these things at the same time. They both engage researchers like me and researchers like my collaborators around pressing questions that are locally rooted around the needs of people on the inside. But at the same time, they're both really actively involved in building an infrastructure of care, of not treating it simply as a research question, but actively preparing for the next hurricane season, mobilizing people into thinking, okay, who needs to be contacted if this part of a state is hit by a hurricane? How much money do we need to buy all of these people, say fans, if there's a heat wave? And how to utilize social media to get a wider public sort of engaged, and a wider public remembering that they also live around many of these facilities, even if they're invisibilized to them. And it's a little small on the screen, I apologize. But these groups pull from a very social science-y definition of disaster, which is that disasters are not natural. That disasters are created by a convergence of natural or human-caused hazards and a population that's been made physically and socially vulnerable. And of course, they lead to the destruction of property, the disruption of community, and the loss of life. And all of us in this little constellation of work and research also place that alongside FEMA's official definition of mitigation, which is an effort to reduce loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disaster, essentially by being proactive, taking action now before the next disaster to reduce these consequences later. And so all of these groups in the last few years have developed a pretty robust set of resources for academic consumption, for public consumption, around looking at the impacts of the institutions of policing and prisons as agents of disaster. So how do these institutions impact communities in ways that somewhat mirror how a hurricane might impact a community if it blows through? And also, how do these institutions shift in function during disaster? So how are they suddenly sites of either a completely unpaid or very, very low paid labor, and how are they suddenly visible to a wider public and a lot of local officials when they sort of need this as a resource? I've shared this a little bit before, but it's been really fulfilling working with these groups to create, this is like a screenshot from like sort of an online digital kind of clickable poster where you can be pulled into peer-reviewed papers that sort of layer how both institutions of policing and imprisonment and disaster disproportionately affect Black, Indigenous, and people of color, LGBTQ people, disrupt local economies, impact sort of social capital and belonging, increase stigma, PTSD research, general health and wellness research, as well as increased infectious disease transmission, and also how these create increased barriers to aid, particularly aid that requires a history of living on the outside, a history of addresses and many different forms of documentation. And so I guess the jumping off point here is that there's a growing movement that is almost seducing people who think a lot about environmental hazards and think their work is purely environmental and purely sort of climate change in a conventional sense. Folks who understand that these events unfold in very predictably inequitable ways along the lines of history and socioeconomic status and race. How people engaged in that work are already on the way to using similar frameworks to abolitionists who are interested in proactively meeting people's material and social needs, and as a way of avoiding the construct of crime or avoiding experiences of imprisonment and policing. And so this entire generation of work and research was really animated by what we witnessed during Hurricane Katrina, where 6,500 incarcerated people were abandoned in, at some points, chest-high water in their cells without water, food, or ventilation. And folks that weren't abandoned were subject to pretty botched evacuation procedures that really demonstrated that the state was not really thinking about these people. I mean, the state, in this case, failed in many different ways. Was particularly not thinking about these people and their safety in the wake of climate events. And these organizers consider all forms of incarceration, a few listed here, from county jails to state prisons, federal prisons, immigration detention, juvenile detention, who all have very different bureaucratic structures and are embedded in local jurisdictions very differently, which comes up and is quite a challenge in a way that I'll share with you. But going back to that sort of research and care infrastructure work, and maybe our jumping off point for thinking about Massachusetts and New England, you know, we publish together, we write things together, we're putting together grants, we can talk about that. I've talked about that before. That's really important work. We've been able to present this to practitioners, emergency management practitioners across the United States. But what I want to spend a little bit more time thinking about today is this idea of care infrastructure and how these groups have mobilized people trained in urban planning, like me. They've mobilized social workers, lawyers, families, residents of a variety of professions and backgrounds to do something like this, like come together, engage in a robust process of listing every single facility within a place, within a state, getting folks together to actually use GIS to map it, getting remote sensing experts. In this case, this is Ufuoma Ovianmata, who's over at MIT, who did this mapping, where we're able to, in real time, see hurricane projections on the local news, look at their storm surge projections, map that alongside our facilities map, and then target specific facilities to launch a phone zapping campaign to get them to evacuate. In this case, this was Hillsborough County Jail, which is near, it's in Tampa, Florida, who were projected to get 9 feet of storm surge. This particular facility, this parcel of land that it's in, and when the group first contacted the jail about potentially evacuating, they laughed. They literally laughed on the phone. The sheriff laughed. And after the organization launched a phone zapping campaign where a greater public in the Hillsborough County area who were under evacuation orders themselves, mandatory evacuation orders, were reckoning with the contradiction that they're being asked to leave, but there's people who are being incarcerated who are forced to stay. And that led to a lot of public pressure, and in this case, Hillsborough County Jail was evacuated. And so when we think about how these organizers work towards making interventions at the intersection of prisons and climate change, really started with getting a very diverse group of people together and having a platform to actually talk to each other, building this inside-outside connection, and specifically reminding people on the outside that if there's a weather event affecting them and possibly affecting them, their ability to live, they should probably flee, then there are people who don't have the freedom to flee, who live in the same community, who should probably be included in the same kinds of planning and resources that, that advantage them. And of course, this goes towards short-term projects like what I mentioned, that phone zapping campaign of like, this prison needs, or this jail needs to be evacuated immediately. But in this instance, a lot of these organizers are also engaged in a longer term project about thinking about abolition, about raising awareness about the stakes of a changing climate and the facilities that we essentially warehouse and disappear a lot of people. And speaking about it in those terms as an invitation for people to offer critique, to improve their work, and also maybe join in themselves. And so this is where I want to talk about New England a little bit, because I live here now. Yeah, and maybe it's like the hazard profile of New England. Like we get some hurricanes, but ever since sort of a systematized like settler record of tropical cyclones, so since 1851, came into being. New England was struck by 30 tropical cyclones. I compare that to my home state of Florida. It's a very different hazard profile. And so I've been sitting for a few years now thinking about the unique hazards that we deal with in New England. We kind of think of it as like quieter than Florida. We don't have these very dramatic events, but increasingly research around how climate change impacts this region is telling a different picture for our immediate future. And that's not to say that flooding isn't important and doesn't happen here. Some of you might be very familiar with MCI Norfolk, which I've been like looking into a lot of documentation about how planners for Norfolk County engage or don't engage this prison. But it's kind of on a hidden island surrounded by the 100-year floodplain. So it's a very dangerous place if we were to have flooding in this area. So if there's flooding that happened and also a medical emergency happening at the same time, which is pretty common, people would be unable to safely leave in an easy way. And there were really only 2 plans, from like economic development plans to the housing plan to hazard mitigation to the general plan for the city of Norfolk, this is the county. Really only 2 plans that actually engage the prison population. One that the housing plan just says we exclude it. And the economic development plan for Norfolk County stated that the prison could be a potential workforce, and this came up in a focus group meeting as people were discussing emergency management. And it's interesting, and I think worthy of critique and some interrogation. But flooding and sort of these named, branded hurricane events that draw a lot of attention, draw a lot of resources, I think are a little bit easier to organize around compared to maybe some of the hazards that we deal with a little bit more regularly here involving extreme temperatures, heat waves, and cold snaps. A few of us were talking about the cold snap that happened in February where, you know, it felt like negative 30 degrees. And there's been increasing attention around how buildings in this region of the country are not designed for these extreme temperature fluctuations. And particularly when thinking about heat, there's so many buildings that have no AC, and AC isn't necessarily required to have a cool building, but they're certainly not designed in ways to cool in ways that even buildings in the southwest of the United States are designed, or even some parts of Florida, though Florida loves AC. As I said, there's already sort of signs of climate change in New England, and climatologists pointing to a potential increase in heat waves specifically. We know that New England, compared to the continental United States and most of the rest of the world, is actually experiencing warming a little bit more acutely based on a variety of factors, where we're situated, where some currents are, just our geography as a region. And it creates a rather unsustainable situation that I think a lot of us maybe need to spend some time thinking about. So in a few states, there are actually laws on the books that say if you're housed in a detention facility, that facility cannot reach this temperature. It needs to be cool. There's a minimum and a maximum temperature. Wisconsin, Arizona, and Mississippi, as pointed out by the Prison Policy Initiative, have that legislated after some like pretty intense court cases. Some other places like Maine also have like a floor and a ceiling that came about without a court case. Massachusetts does have a floor, but not a ceiling, which is going to become more of an issue as the region warms. In response to families already beginning to file complaints about their loved ones being incarcerated in too hot facilities, the Department of Corrections has already said it's not physically possible to install air conditioning in all facilities. And it leads to stories like this. Carlos Morales has spoken about his experience in the media and elsewhere. And he remembers being so hot during heat waves that he would beg correction officers to leave the small opening in his cell door open. He said that the tiny fan in his cell just blew hot air at him, and that fan cost him $26 in the canteen, and not everyone has money to afford that. And this is the kind of organizing that the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons has been actively engaged in the South, that some people need fans immediately. There's also a larger critique to be had of how inflated some of the prices are in the canteen, but there's an immediate need. Folks from the Prisoners' Legal Services of Massachusetts have been asking for sort of maximum heat levels, because currently the floor is at 64 or 68 degrees, and there is a maximum during the cold months, so there's not too many resources used for heating. But between June and September, there is no sort of ceiling for temperature. And so that creates a very deadly environment for a lot of people incarcerated. And also heat death is like very difficult to have documented and have attributed to heat. And this is where I think we can learn a little bit from Texas, where a lot of my collaborators are based and where we're continuing to do some research, and also building out this infrastructure of care, where between 2001 and 2019, there were potentially 271 deaths in Texas prisons, in their state prisons, attributed to extreme heat. And there are folks like my collaborators, J. Carly Purdom and Benika Dixon, who are looking at this intersection of heat and prisons and also other kind of COVID-19, but also like chronic health conditions. This is really, really important work that actually does not require really advanced social science methods. Much of this report, which they generated and handed over to the Texas State Legislature, was just collecting stories, like just bearing witness after developing relationships with people who would feel comfortable sharing that they deliberately flooded their cell because it was too hot and they had no options, or that they engaged in many different small and large acts of resistance. In Texas's case, there's like a little bit of, I have some optimism and there's some pessimism here. So the Texas House, influenced by TPCA's actions and the organizing by incarcerated people, actually approved a bill to cool all Texas prisons before 2029. The Texas Senate has not voted on this, and there's also like a bureaucratic showdown over budgeting and how much money should be allocated for this. So it's a bit stalled right now. And we are continuing to do research, but also agitate a little bit around how extreme heat is pretty dangerous to all of us. It's actually what kills in terms of climate hazards, it kills more people than hurricanes, it kills more people than blizzards, even all kinds of flooding annually in the United States. So we're kind of agitating around, like, we should all be taking this a little bit more seriously, and then also the disproportionate, inequitable impacts of heat are magnified on the inside. And this is where I ask you to join us, because it's going to take the organizing of incarcerated people, local organizations here in New England, like Deeper Than Water, which focuses on water issues and prison facilities, families, journalists, researchers, social workers, urban planners, and public health folks, to really build a network as robust as we have it in the South. Not that the network in the South is perfect, but there's a bit of a muscle memory every hurricane season to prepare for hazards in a specific way. And we don't quite have that as a community here. There's just disparate people kind of working on different things. Going back to this issue of like jurisdictional, like every kind of facility is kind of governed by different sort of bureaucratic structures based on if the county oversees it, if the state oversees it, if it's a federal facility. Boston as a city has actually done some pretty cutting edge work around heat resilience planning. It's like really, really incredible. There's this report that came out last year on heat resilience solutions. It makes no mention of any of the carceral facilities within Boston, because the city of Boston doesn't manage it. It's like Suffolk County that manages it, it's the state. So there is a lot of planning around and a lot of movement around the unincarcerated population. But these facilities, even if jurisdictionally they're not under the city of Boston, the weather doesn't care. It's here, it's embedded in our community, and it's going to take very creative ways of thinking about space, about land, and about our organizations to grapple with these challenges. And I've been speaking about Massachusetts, but the landscape looks pretty different in some other states. So like I mentioned, Maine actually has a sort of ceiling and a floor for temperature in in its prisons. Vermont is currently kind of trying to avoid the Texas case and actually work out a lot of the implementation costs modeling ahead of time. It took the ACLU suing the state of Rhode Island in 2019 over heating issues for Rhode Island to start equipping its facilities and having standards for floors and ceilings for temperature. New Hampshire has a recent history of incarcerated people going on hunger strike over extreme heat and being willing to die, which is obviously incredibly unjust and unnecessary. And Connecticut also has reports almost every year of heating systems going out for days at a time. And in all of these cases, including Massachusetts, it's also incredibly hard to know what the truth is. There's guidelines on how to measure temperature, but the spaces are pretty opaque. And so this is again why it requires a diversity of actors who have different points in and different perspectives in order to build a case and do the kind of work that's required to do good research, and to collect good stories, and take those stories to meaningful places where people can actually act on them, but also building an infrastructure of care. You really have to know people on the, most of this organizing looks like, okay, we know this facility is being hit by a storm. Who knows someone, who has a loved one who's incarcerated there? How do we get in touch with them? And then how do we have them tell their friends on the inside to also reach out to us? It's incredibly difficult, and it requires a lot of relationship building. It requires a lot of love. It requires a lot of stakes being made clear. And so maybe in New England, we don't have exactly this, like we could have exactly this, of modeling facilities, doing storm surge projections. Hurricane season's pretty wild, of just checking the weather every single day. There's like a forecaster who's giving out alerts to our group. It could look like something else because our region has very particular needs. And like I said, heat waves and cold snaps are less flashy than a large storm with a name approaching. And so it's going to take a lot of us to both address this sort of changing political conditions based on where you are, and also this increasingly unmanageable challenge of climate change on our physical infrastructure and even on our bodies. And so I know you've been showed a QR code before, but if you want to get connected, we're in the very early stages. Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons has recently just kind of indicated they're wanting to support developing a network of researchers and of actors in the Northeast to be thinking about this and to be planning for it, or just to get more information out. So I'm going to be kicking off at least 2 info sessions this summer. Dates to be determined. It'll be digital. But if you want to hear about those, here's a QR code, or you can go to this tiny URL. This is not being shared with an organization. It's not even being shared with Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons. You'll just get an email from me, Darian, the person, and we can have some time to chat about what we can do here, because it's going to take a lot of work. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Darian. Let's give another round of applause, Darian. Wow, thank you so much for all the work you're doing, particularly talking to us what's going on right here in Boston. So, wow, did not know all that. So, thank you. So, right now, I'm going to ask the 3 scholars to join me at the table where we'll be starting the Q&A, first in person and then online. So, if you are online, if you have questions, be sure to put them into the chat. But we'll be right there at the that front table with the chairs. Okay, so we're gonna be starting the Q&A. section, first from the audience, but I'll just begin with a first question. So I know many of you have different areas of research, obviously focusing on environmental and racial justice. For those who either minimize or deny climate justice and or racial justice, what has been the most challenging aspect of helping them understand what you do and why it's so important? Anyone can answer.
Is it already on? It is already on. All right. I'll let others answer about the most challenging. The thing that I find most helpful is making it more attainable and more local. So even, in the Homa community, people say that there's not climate change, but they know that they used to have more land in their yard than they do now, that they used to be able to grow vegetables, that their trees used to be full, that they actually had pecans or citrus on them. So making it more, relatable, I think helps. Yeah. I'll stop there.
Definitely, thank
you.
I think the advantage of focusing on these really intense flashpoints of disaster are that for the issues that intersect with that, I think, and like what I shared today, as a starting point, I don't even need people to necessarily be completely on board with the concept of climate change, because the fact that a hurricane just blew through is like undeniable. Whether or not we'll experiencing, stronger hurricanes or more frequent hurricanes is, that's something that can be discussed. But just the fact that our present conditions are very unsustainable and unworkable for a lot of us, it's a very easy point for me to invite people into like, hey, like, I don't know, a hurricane just destroyed this entire town. That's awful. It's undeniably awful and maybe shouldn't happen. So I think, I find ease in using disasters as a way to bring people in.
To start the conversation. Yeah.
I think, is this on? It's good? Okay, good. I'm just going to build on that. I actually don't really use the term climate change very much in my work. I find it, I think it's pretty political that we say climate change and not global warming, and, call it what it is. And so I find that's why I focus on materiality and bodies. Like, it's very hard to, like, when is it a bad idea not to destroy the planet, right? Even whether or not you think climate change is real, like, when is it actually a bad idea to not waste everything and pollute food and pollute soil? Like, what is the harm there? And so I think in my work, it's mostly not people who are diametrically opposed ideologically, but I think coming back to your point, it is hard work, and it actually takes a lot of just kind of nuts and bolts every day showing up that is asking a lot of the communities that are suffering most. So the example I think of is, I worked with young people all over Philadelphia, and even when there was a year where there was a lot of high attrition out of these kind of internship programs or, programs that had to do with either urban agriculture, which is very small, very small piece of the pie. But rarely when I was doing exit interviews with them, rarely was it like, I hate the environment or, climate change isn't real. It was like, I actually need a job that pays me more regularly. Like, I'm saving up for college. I need a car. I need, so there are these kind of material barriers that are less about what they believe and more about just the practicalities of being part of this work and also trying to survive when your country is trying to kill you.
Thank you so much. And now we'll turn it over for the audience. So if anyone wants to, in the audience that has a question, that would like to ask a question, we ask that you just come up to the podium where that nice microphone is. Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Greer.
Hello. Just wanted to say, first of all, what an amazing presentation from all three of you, and how I found the experience transformational. I wanted to share that. My question is about, I love the term embodied action, because as a social worker and a clinical social worker, I'm very concerned with changing the material conditions in people's worlds. So I wondered if all of you had some consejo or advice for social workers, particularly young social workers that are not part of the movement quite yet, but how they can get involved in trying to take embodied action to make the world a better place.
Well, I talked about the body, so I guess I should start. Thank you for that question. I think a lot of that work is happening here. The first thing that comes to mind, I'm grateful for this question, because I think one of the things I wanted to highlight was that, my work is predominantly with young people, but I work in intergenerational spaces purposefully, because there's a lot of kind of like youth activism, youth are going to save the world, and they're like, this is y'all's problem. Like, why are you expecting us to save you? And it's a lot of pressure and it's a lot of burden to put on young people. So to the question of what might be useful and also just necessary is that there's just so much energy and expertise within the communities that whatever population you're working with already have. And it's just gonna make your job a lot easier when you're tapped into that, or at least know people who are tapped into that. So the work you're doing around, the collaborators that you're participating in, like the different projects that you're doing, I think collaboration is key. And like one example, so my work is mostly in foodways and food literacies, and so like we would have young people do foodways interviews with elders, because there's a lot of history that we might know in terms of policy, in terms of kind of macro level conversations about what's happening with land, either like erasure acts or land attribution, but there's just a lot of kind of the personal narrative that we're missing. So yeah, just knowing who's in your community. I think Octavia Butler writes about the fact that like the people who are going to save the apocalypse, or who are going to survive the apocalypse, are the people who know their neighbors, because when everything else falls apart, like, do you know who's on your block? So yeah, I think that's part of it.
Yeah, I think I guess like kinship I see show up quite a bit in organizing around the prisons, and really an unfortunate, or people, the word hostage comes up sometimes, of like the people really reckoning with bodies being tied to land when they have a loved one who is essentially kept in a cage or a warehouse and cannot leave. Their household decisions, their emotions, their just cycles of the passage of time, how they feel moving through time, being tied to the experience of someone who's kept in a place, potentially for the rest of their lives, is kind of unfortunately an easy way for people to start thinking about bodies and land. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of a grim answer. I'm sorry.
Can I finish out the question? So there's two really great examples here. Well, three really. So there's movements, physically engaging with the environment through your food aspects, right? There's the storytelling, people talking about the histories and their experiences, that could be brought into almost any level of practice. and then community organizing. There's this great book. There's several good books that's come out in the last 10 years for social workers around eco social work, green social work. The one that's like super practical, thank you, for teaching social workers is by Christina Erickson, and she uses the generalist model to show how a social worker can, at every level of practice, integrate environmental justice into their practice. So since we only have a minute left, I'll stop there.
Oh, that was great.
Thank you all so much. I also want to share, this was very transformational, especially for someone who's currently experiencing climate dread, so I appreciate all of your insights. My question is to Darian, but also everybody else. I'm wondering, in the absence of sort of robust centralized government response, if you saw and how you responded to the potential unsustainability of relying on sort of mutual aid networks, or, you know, when people just like go back home and then it's hard to get back in touch with them, and how you responded to that and your thoughts on that.
That's actually what drew me to social work. I was, in 2005, I was working at a crisis intervention center, and at the same time, I was in the Air National Guard, and my emergency job was to work at the crisis center for handling a disaster. And I'd get off from there and I'd go to the crisis center. And the government was completely inept from doing everything from way beforehand, 5 days out, trying to organize, where social workers were utilizing their networks and trying to get people out, making sure people had food. That's what drew me to social work. How do I address it? I do research.
Yeah.
Mine's more open.
Yeah, I know. I feel that I haven't quite felt settled in a way to deal with the fatigue or occasional feelings of futility. Though I think, I don't know, like, people celebrate small wins, right? Like, even my slide of like, we evacuated one jail, was just so, and people in the group like knew people who were currently at the Hillsborough County Jail, and maybe this is also where storytelling feels really, really important. I do personally think, relying on informal mutual aid networks of local actors is pretty unsustainable in and of itself. At the same time, it's like very, I don't know, it's inspiring in like a self-reinforcing way, like people being reminded that, because it's very easy to just be a family of someone who's incarcerated and just like feel really upset if they're not evacuated from a hurricane, especially if you live in Florida, where that panic comes up every other year. So I don't know. There does seem to be like some movement. I don't want to say the state is like completely inept and unable to do things. I think there's been surprising amount of people really receptive in like conventional emergency management spaces, which the conferences that I would go to for emergency management are like a lot of current or like ex-police officers, a lot of people in the military who were like very open to talking about abolition and talking about the unsustainability of and sharing stories of themselves from their own practice of why something else needs to be built, and also being some of the people to start doing that nudging. So on some level, I feel good about it, like in a high level sense, but yeah, it's really easy to be, to feel like, wow, this like signal group of mutual aid organizers is like not enough. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more quick question, and then we'll turn it over to Danny to close us out. Any other?
So thank you all for really wonderful presentations. My name is Greg. I'm from the School of Public Health here at BU, so coming from a different disciplinary background. So Darian, I want to build on your last thought there of, yes, there's so much work to do and it can be overwhelming, but there's also hope. And in some ways, you know, there's also never been so much action in this space. And so I was wondering if you could each close us out with a little bit of what you see that gives you hope and optimism.
Thank you for that question, because I didn't want to leave here depressed. I kind of connecting to the last question, the first thing that came to mind is this book called Participation as Tyranny by Cook and Kathari, I think, who are international ed people. But what I appreciate about that is they kind of deconstruct these like scales, right? Like local, government, national, international. And I mean, those are real, but those are constructed. I was reading that at a time where I was living in Samoa, which is a very small island, and you know, the like head of the organization I was working at was like at my Zumba class, right? And so it felt very manageable in that context. And so I was thinking about ways, what would that look like, even when the population itself isn't, you know, tiny. And so I think for me, thinking more about how, yes, these scales, these groups are real and they're instantiated, but we created them, which means we can deconstruct them when we need to. And I think in your slides, Dr. Billow, you had sort of the Bronfenberger like socioecological theory stuff. And so, you know, you have the micro, meso, but you have the micro all the way to the macro, but you have the meso, right? Which is kind of that in-between space. So I'm just really interested in that in-between space. And obviously I like telling stories. And I do think research is just telling stories. Sometimes you use numbers, sometimes you use quotes, sometimes you use other things. But I think the stories we tell kind of define who we are.
I'm really hopeful because I got some responses on that Google form that I just sent out. So I'm gonna be reaching out to y'all because, we should, because there's some work to be done, and really it only takes a few people to really mobilize an entire region. It's not like the groups that I mentioned are like super huge, organized. They're not like, well, TPCA is a 501c3. Fight Toxic Prisons is not. It's a group chat, and we're able to pull together, you know, people of a variety of skill sets to mobilize entire regions or communities of people. And so if I look at the numbers of people who just signed up, like that's more than enough. That's more than the active people in the group in the South. So I feel very hopeful, and I look forward to reaching out to y'all and maybe scheming together a little bit.
That's actually part of my answer, is that I don't feel alone. I feel hopeful that I think, can say that this is no longer a movement. This is like embedded in the social fabric of what we have decided as a society, that we need to address climate change to maintain the well-being of our society. It's embedded in the fabric now. I mean, NIH is funding climate change and mental health research. SAMHSA, so I think that's what I feel hopeful for. I'm not alone, and it's a necessity at this point. Thank you.
People still hear? Okay, there we go. So thank you all. So let's give one last final round of applause to Dr. Relay, Badaki, and Darren. So thank you all so much for sharing your time, all your knowledge and expertise, all the research you're doing for improving the lives of community, particularly those who belong to underrepresented groups who are too often minimized, if not forgotten. We want to close by thanking a lot of individuals, people, and committees today. So on behalf of the School of Social Work and the Equity and Inclusion Committee, I'd like to express our thanks and appreciation to all of you, obviously, for being here. Also, we want to give thanks to Boston University Diversity and Inclusion team for funding the Emerging Scholars Program, because this would totally not be possible without them, particularly Rick Megan, who heads so much. Also, thank you so much to our co-sponsors who also made this possible, the Center for Innovation and Social Work and Health at BUSSW. So thank you. Dean Delva and Ellie for all your hard work. The BU School of Public Health Center for Climate and Health Department of Environmental Health. So let's give a round of applause. They've been so instrumental. My two professors here has helped us so much with the planning as well. So thank you. And also, especially, I want to give a shout out to the co-chairs of the Emerging Scholars Program. So doctors Belkin Martinez and Dr. DeVoe. So let's give a round of applause for those who help with co-chairing. Thank you so much. Also to acknowledge and thank Greer Hamilton. A huge round of applause. Without this, nothing would have been possible. Greer has worked for months and has planned everything, getting everyone organized. Nothing would be possible without her. So mil gracias. Thank you for everything. Also, Ashley Chen, thank you so much, student here, for all of her assistance with web and tech. And I know this is not the only place you help us out with. And also to the marketing communications team, Marcom, Michelle and Lily, thank you all so much for all your promotional work, advertising and social media, and getting the word out. And thank you everyone else who participated for your support and guidance. So just a quick reminder that the 2 CEU credits will be, probably pronounced that wrong, will be available to social workers licensed in Massachusetts upon completion of a brief post-event quiz. And you can contact swequity@bu.edu with any questions. So make sure to use the QR link in the survey to fill that out. And we hope that information for today's presentation will help all to continue our fight for justice. Que sigamos. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel.
Also, for those who cannot do the QR code, we will email it to you as well. So don't worry. So much great feedback, so y'all did great. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get you some food and break.